getting then into, so let's say we've got, okay, I've read a book or two, I've got a general understanding, a working knowledge of this to some extent. I want to start to dive into some type of papers. Does study type matter? Because I don't know if a lot of people understand that there are different types of study and study designs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where do we go from there, and how do we look for that?
So I would say when you're jumping onto PubMed or Google Scholar, however you're going to look for your papers, first of all, have a very specific idea of what you want to look up. Unless you're someone who has eternal focus, you can really just dive down a rabbit hole and, like end up reading something 10 steps away from what you started reading when you start searching, which is good. I mean, it's interesting, it's fun. But if you really want an answer to a specific question, think about it, write down some keywords, search those, and really follow the trail. Find, when you do your first search, find a good meta-analysis or review. And what that is, for those who don't know, is that's when a scientist in that field has sort of collected as many articles as possible from that field to synthesize what is known about a particular topic. So the cool thing about that is not only do you get a bunch of articles and a bunch of conclusions from different scientists in one paper, you also have the benefit of that paper having been vetted by competitors in the field. So the way that science publication works in peer-reviewed journals is they send the article into the journal to be published, and then the journal sends it to a bunch of your competitors who want to shoot you down if at all possible because they're in competition with you. So if it's been published, that means your competitors have said, you know what, this is pretty good. This is a pretty fair review or analysis of this particular topic. So I think that's a really good place to start. They tend to be a little bit easier to read than a primary article as well. And they also give you a list of primary articles to read for yourself if you're skeptical about one or more conclusions.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you agree also, just like always strengths and weaknesses with these types of things, that with a systematic review or a meta-analysis or both, that garbage in can equal garbage out sometimes? So even though a systematic review is a synopsis of all of the available evidence, if the available evidence is not very good, then you'd be cautious with the conclusions of the systematic review. Is that fair?
I think so. I think it depends on, I think for nutrition, that tends to be less true. I think the newer the field, the more likely there's a little garbage in the peer-reviewed journals, just because there's less going on, there's less competition, people are getting things published more easily. I think in the field of nutrition, a review is less likely to have that. I think in sports science, it's more likely, just because there's a lot of studies that are done really low power, few participants, things like that, and some sort of small sects of bias in that field still. So it's always good. You always have to be skeptical. You always have to think about alternate conclusions, but the newer the field, the more likely that's true. And I think the more established the field, the less likely.
Maybe I'll just jump in real quick. Maybe it's prudent to talk about something that people might have been exposed to insofar as differences between, say, levels of evidence versus the quality of a study that's being done. Can you speak to what those are and how we can start to figure out what's what?
What do you mean by levels of evidence? You mean
so like level one evidence being
versus...
Or I mean like a systematic review or meta-analysis being, or an RCT as like a top level of evidence versus like a case study or something like that.
Right. So some of the, and I guess that plays into the types of study as well. So you can have something like a case study, as you said, which they're studying one or two people and looking at particular progress in those people. I think that probably happens less. That happens more often in medical research than anything else. But you can get a ton of detail from a study like that, but you don't know how well you can apply it to everyone. So similarly to human studies where there's just a few subjects, you can get a lot of detail and a lot of control when you're doing human experimental studies, but you don't know how well you can apply it because it's not a large sample pool. Mm-hmm. There are things like cohort studies and surveys where the scientists are asking tons and tons of people from all over the place and different, they might set a range of ages and a certain demographic, but you get so much data. The problem with that is that people lie, so you get less detail. So it's really good if you want to believe a conclusion. It's really nice if you can see that one study has found that in a huge survey study, and this is the conclusion they've come to. And another study has done a controlled trial where they're, taking humans, asking them to eat or do a certain thing, and then measuring outcomes. And maybe even an animal study or a molecular study where they've said, okay, this is what we think the mechanism, we think this is how this happens. And then that's been confirmed in another study. So the more types of studies you see coming to the same conclusion, the more you can feel good about it.
Gotcha.
They all have their strengths and weaknesses. No,
right.
Sorry.
So just to that point then, would it be accurate to say that with all of those different types of studies, they may also be, well designed or poorly designed, and that too is going to influence what we can take from them and how readily we can apply the conclusions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would be great to think that anything that was published in a peer-reviewed journal is well designed, but that's not always the case. So that's, I think, one of the most important things when you're deciding to dive into reading scientific literature is you really need to set aside time. It's not like reading a quick blog or an internet meme. It's dense literature. It takes a long time. You need to read any one paper. I usually read 2 or 3 times before I really feel comfortable that I understand what's going on. And you need to put on your skeptic hat and think about, how did they do this? Like, are there any alternate conclusions? Is there a control that they missed? So even just reading a little bit online about the scientific method before doing this is a good idea. It sounds rudimentary, but really understanding how controls work so that you can judge whether a good control was used in experimental studies, and really thinking about how variables work and how conclusions can be drawn can be really helpful.